Hey, hi, Lonesome family out there. This is Nick Einterz. I'm here with Kevin Slick. Kevin Slick is a cornerstone of the bluegrass community here in Colorado, and really, in a lot of ways, very much connected and networked across the nation with all types of performers. And we have him on both to talk about bluegrass, but also to talk about some of his music, some stuff he's just released, and some of the stuff that he has in his catalog going back to the 90s. So we're going to go ahead and get started here with just talking about bluegrass.
Great.
You have seen a lot of change in bluegrass since I guess you first were introduced to it. And
Yeah.
I'm aware of generally the last 20 years of, development in the bluegrass world, but it's a relatively limited perspective. So I'm curious, what have you seen in your time?
Well, I've seen several different moments when people were deeply concerned about bluegrass being ruined by this thing or that thing that was coming in, whatever it was, or just changed in some way. And one of the groups that I remember hearing, probably first when I was a young kid, was the Country Gentlemen. My dad was a huge fan of the Country Gentlemen. And they were doing some really unique things in that they were doing not only songs by Bob Dylan and Tom Paxton and people like that, they were also going back into the archives and bringing out older folk music. So they were doing music that was not strictly out of the Bill Monroe canon.
Predates the canon.
Yeah, and so that was kind of a new thing. And they were also an urban band. They were very much an urban band out of Washington, D.C. And that was
Interesting.
kind of a different thing for some people. And maybe the vocal stylings were a little bit, I mean, Charlie Waller, just one of the most amazing vocalists in bluegrass history, I think, has a voice that's at times would go a little bit more towards the crooner side and not be a strictly country sounding thing. So over the years, it has changed and it's evolved, and that's, I think, a good thing. Any genre artistically, whether it's music, dance, film, theater, whatever, if it survives, it will diversify. And that diversity, I think, is a measure of the strength of the genre. And people will sometimes be confused by that. The New York Times famously panned Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It's like, what's this? What's the orchestras? This isn't rock and roll. What are
Right.
these guys doing?
It will be forgotten.
Yes, and so that sort of thing perhaps amuses or confuses people, and they don't quite know what to do with it. But if you think back, there was a time when rock and roll was Little Richard and Chuck Berry. That's
For
it.
sure.
And jazz was what they played in New Orleans, what we now call Dixieland jazz. And now there's everything else.
Right.
And so with bluegrass, I think, we have names like traditional and new grass. Those are kind of accepted now. They've been around for long enough. And we'll probably develop some new terms too. Maybe there'll be chamber grass. Maybe a group like Hocktail will be like chamber grass, like a
Sure.
band that's doing
I've never heard that. That's a
instrumental.
really interesting phrase.
I just made it up.
Oh, well
We should
done.
copyright
Very
it right
nice.
now.
Right now.
before we-
Okay. We heard it first
but
here.
yeah, so I don't know. Maybe or jazz grass or whatever. Twisted Pine might be doing jazz grass or funk grass. I don't know. But it's a wonderful thing to see. I think. The new artists that are coming along because most of the people that I hear like Molly Tuttle or Billy Strings, they have such a breadth of knowledge of music that they can intelligently discuss, play, and analyze everything from Snoop Dogg to Ella Fitzgerald to Mahalia Jackson to Louis Armstrong to Hank Williams or whatever, Woody Guthrie or something like that.
Absolutely.
And it all goes together in that way.
Yeah, when you look back at the tree, almost it's a tree, I imagine,
Yeah.
of all these genre splits. Because you're right, we had Dixieland that Louis Armstrong really took that and made it a nationally recognized thing, and then of course did all types of things to the genre to develop it.
Yeah.
And then when you look at where jazz kind of started to level off, in like the late '60s, then you see how far that genre came in 50 years. And what I guess a lot of people may not contextualize, or at least I try to contextualize, is think, all right, well, we had this whole genre of music called blues before bluegrass was even a thing.
Yeah.
For decades. And blues, obviously that split. and it went toward rock, it went toward country, it split into bluegrass.
Yeah.
And then here we are with the Molly Tuttles, the Billy Strings, the Hot Tails, all of these bands that are, like you said, borrowing from everything. It has created so many colors, right? And I'm curious, as that tree developed throughout history, and obviously you're a student of it. What were some of the big benchmarks? What were the goalposts that you think were most kind of meaningful?
Well, it's interesting with bluegrass in that when bluegrass first started, as we now look back on it and say, well, it started in 1946. That's when it started. They weren't really referring to it as that at that time. It was another type of country music that was on the Grand Ole Opry.
It was just a name, right?
Yeah, and
Bluegrass Boys.
It was when you got enough people playing it, then it was like people started to say, well, we got to give this some kind of name, because now there's the Stanley Brothers and now there's these other groups that are all doing it. So obviously, the big bang of Earl Scruggs coming in, and I will admit to being a banjo-centric bluegrass historian, in that I think that bluegrass music began when Earl joined the band. That was the distinctive sound, because he was doing something radically different than what String Bean was doing before him.
Very true.
That music was great too, and it would perhaps more accurately be called old-time string band music now, or old-time country music. That was obviously a big moment. When it started spreading through the folk music revival of the 60s, and you had bands out of Boston, Charles River Boys and people like that, doing this kind of music, and then doing contemporary music. They did the Beetlegrass album, which, again, you look back on it now and you think, okay, well, doing I've Just Seen a Face as a bluegrass song is not that big of a step.
No, absolutely not.
It was 95% there when the Beatles did it, but when you at that time, it was like, whoa, that's something else. And I think that was certainly a huge moment. Old in the Way would certainly be a benchmark in that you had this wonderful element of these people like Grisman and Garcia that loved this music, loved early bluegrass music.
Right.
And just started playing it. And by virtue of the connections that they had made to fans, people started listening and saying, well, yeah, this is pretty cool. The Circle Being Broken album was huge. That was one for me that was big, because I was a big fan of the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, and I had a couple of their albums before that. So when that came out, it was like, well, okay, so we got to buy the new Nitty Gritty Dirt Band album. And I don't even remember it being that strange, but it was like, oh, Roy Acuff and Maybelle Carter and all these people on it. Like, I wouldn't have thought about that, but I listened to it because I understood these people. I understood the Dirt Band. They looked like musicians as far as I could tell. They had long hair and beards. So I thought, well, I'm going to check this out. And then you hear Roy Acuff singing, and it's like, well, this is kind of cool. Like, this is actually pretty neat. Like, the way he sings is like really soulful, and it's really powerful. That was huge, I think. Certainly, dog music, Grisman's kind of connection with the jazz scene in there was a phenomenal moment.
It has stayed very influential, hasn't it?
Yeah, and it definitely, again, opened it up to like, oh yeah, this has like a real direct connection to Django Reinhardt and Stepan Garpelli and people like that. Like, I can see why these music forms are cousins. They work together. There's some great. I mean, have you ever seen Bluegrass Country Soul? That video. It's one I'd recommend. It was made in 1971, I believe, at Bluegrass Festival.
Oh.
And it's a great document of this time where, they're talking about it again like it's something unbelievable. It's like, well, yes, the long hairs from the city are playing with the squares from the country, and you see all these people jamming, and it's a wonderful video too, because you got Jimmy Martin, you got the Osborne Brothers, you got the Country Gentlemen, you got Sam Bush and Tony Rice when they were teenagers, Ricky Skaggs when he was playing with
wow, that really is a confluence, isn't it? You get old time hitting the new trajectory,
and at that point it was like, oh, look at this, guys with long hair playing, Sally Gooden. Imagine that. And it's a wonderful document of that time. And that's, I think, was that's also a sort of important moment that was documented of
right.
when this music started catching on. And that's kind of how I got back into it. I'd heard it, of course, when I was growing up because my dad played it around the house all the time, but it didn't quite register. It was a little bit, maybe
I've heard that a lot.
A little bit too intense.
A lot of people grew up with it.
Yeah.
Had forsaken it for whatever reason and then found it again.
Yeah. And, I got into it, as probably a lot of people did when I was in college, and was getting more into folk music and then realizing, like, ooh, there's this other stuff. Like, I was in Philadelphia at the time and, going to, like, the Philadelphia Folk Festival and seeing bands like Joe Val and the New England Bluegrass Boys and, like, man, this guy's intense. This is as intense as any punk music that's coming down the scene in the late 70s,
Yeah.
It's that kind of energy. And so I think those are certainly some of the benchmarks or highlights along the way. And then technology, as technology's developed. Because it's a music form that was first shared via radio. Technology, right. 20th century technology.
That's a great point.
And then records. And then as records traveled around, that allowed people like myself in Pennsylvania to hear this stuff, which I wouldn't have, maybe even 50 years earlier, I wouldn't have heard music that was being made in North Carolina.
Well, I got to say, I do like the banjo-centric.
Yes.
I can't help but obviously like that part of it. It's funny to think about Old and Away in that sense because that was Jerry's first instrument.
Yeah.
In terms of he was obsessed with it, and I don't know if it was his wife or his girlfriend at the time was basically like, that instrument's a little grating, and,
Yes.
So all of the husbands and wives of banjo players out there, we salute you.
Sorry.
Yeah, but you talk about technology, and I've often thought about the banjo in that sense because. Yeah. The other instruments in a bluegrass band, save the dobro, but the guitar, the upright, and the fiddle, these are instruments with long storied pasts.
Yeah.
And the banjo has a long past, but in the form that we know it now, in the Scruggs form, it's really only a few decades old.
Yeah.
And so it makes a lot of sense to think about bluegrass music as kind of following the banjo's expression.
Yeah.
Because it was already a new technology. We don't think about it necessarily, but even that fifth string and the metal and the wood, evolution of the instrument was big stuff, no doubt. And so I got to at least give some props to that point. I love that. I do want to go back to something you had mentioned about the folk music in the '60s being a big part of it. And the reason I think it's a good opportunity to both kind of talk about songwriting in bluegrass, which I think is a very fascinating topic in and of itself.
Yeah.
But also because that's something that you have focused on in your discography. So. When we look at bluegrass, songwriters aren't necessarily the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah.
It more so recently, I'd say. You've I look at Alison Krauss and Aoife O'Donovan in particular in the last 20 years as just people who would have made it in the folk world purely on their writing, but are bluegrass musicians. And I'm curious how you see songwriting within the context of bluegrass development.
Yeah, that's a great area to look at, and it has, I think, you're right. To maybe the casual listener, the first thing they pick up on is the speed and the dexterity of the people playing. Yeah, the people playing the instruments, and that certainly jumps out at you. And it's an area that I think you can get lost in easily. I think about it with instrumentals, for example. I hear a lot of bluegrass instrumentals on recordings, and I think, well, this is like a series of really hot licks, and it's really fast, and okay, that's cool. But then I'll hear something like Salt Spring and think, now there's a melody. I could sing that melody.
Sure.
The second time it comes around, I could sing that melody because it's such a strong and beautiful melody. And I think, whoa, that's coming from a slightly different place.
Excellent
that's
point.
Coming from a place that's more about melody. And with bluegrass songwriting, the first generation, Flatt and Scruggs and Stanley Brothers and Bill Monroe, they were writing about real things. I mean,
Absolutely.
Bill Monroe writes about, his cabin on the hill and stuff like that. It really was indeed a house on a hill. And On my way back to the old home place. That's like real stuff. And I think you can sing that. I could sing that now and feel something about it. I could connect to the feeling that Bill Monroe had, but it's not really real for me.
Right, right.
And so when I hear some modern bluegrass music, and it's talking about the one-room shack and things like that, I don't know. Sometimes I'll give them a little leeway if it's an otherwise good melody, but I think it was on a Steep Canyon Rangers album recently. They had a song about listening to the radio, and they talked about listening to Casey Kasem, and I thought, yes, I can identify with that. I know what that's like because I did that too in the 1970s, and we could use some more songs about the little home on the cul-de-sac in the housing development rather than just the cabin on the hill, because we didn't all grow up, on my daddy's farm. I did live on a farm from the time I was 12, to an adult, but it's like we could expand. We could expand it a bit, and so there's, I think the songs that stick with us, the songs that really, especially in modern, if I'm saying, say, from 1960s on, if we're calling this like the modern age of bluegrass, maybe let's say 1970 as just a round off point. The songs that really stick with you are songs that are powerful melodies and songs like "Wait a Minute" by the Solemn Scene. That is a brilliant song by Herb Pedersen, and it's a song that's universal because we've all had this experience of being away from the people we love,
right?
And it's very real. It touches something real, and so when people can do that and can sing about something that is really real. And so like some of the artists you were mentioning, when I listen to those people now, and Becky Buller is a great writer right now. I love her music. She writes about like people that she knows and things that she knows, and when she sings it, I believe it. I think, I get that you're there, and it doesn't feel like she's writing about like a different time in history, but those emotions are the same. And so that's, I think, is an interesting thing to try to tap into, is to not, in bluegrass, to not necessarily go with, okay, I'm going to do, there's a cabin on the hill and my dad and mom have died and they're buried there, and,
right.
Whatever. Just like in country music, like I'm not going to do the truck or the beer or the cut off shorts or whatever, thing like that. Challenge yourself.
Absolutely. No, that's a really excellent point. And I can't help but notice that, that type of like being more expressive and more expressive about the time that you're living, about your own experiences, like that whole kind of development also mirrors a little bit of the banjo, because it started off as kind of the rhythmic side of bluegrass. And obviously Scruggs was putting a number of really interesting licks in there, but they are licks. I mean, these are not, when the banjo 30, 40 years later, all of a sudden you get Pete Wernick, who's using a phaser pedal, Bela Fleck, Bill Keith. Don Reno is a contemporary of Scruggs, but he's becoming more known because it's clear that the banjo has this whole side to it that is extremely melodic and expressive. It doesn't have to just rely on rhythmic, technique. And obviously Scruggs is the foundation, just like Bill Monroe's writing is the foundation. But I agree with you. I think the development and bringing people into the community really only happens if they can identify with it. And obviously some people still can identify, many people can still identify with what Bill Monroe was writing with. I mean, I'm from southern Indiana, and Bean Blossom is right down the street, so it's basically the imagery of my home. But you're making a really interesting point about the imagery and the metaphors that we come across in the music. I'm curious about the last 20 years, because we are in 2022, so like the turn of the millennium, right? This big important moment. What has happened to songwriting in bluegrass in your mind in the last 2 decades?
Well, I think there is certainly still, there's a lot of people that are writing stuff that I would say is very much here's the template of what we're going to make for a bluegrass song, because there's more demand too.
Sure.
A lot of people are recording. We have a lot of bands now, a lot of bands recording, so there's a lot of a lot of writers that are just really cranking out material because there's a need for it, and the festival scene has grown, and that's a pretty amazing thing. Um, One of the things I love is, well, I'll go back to Hot Rise's last studio album. That record just has so many great songs on it. When I first listened to it, again, the first time I listened to it, when I'm free, that's where I'll be. I was like, oh, I can sing along with that. I love that. Well, you were on my mind this morning. And I'm like, oh, that's a really catchy melody. And again, it's like it's a real song talking about real people. It's maybe funny to think about it, but to me, when I listen to those songs like that, a lot of it being Tim O'Brien's work, is there's a sophistication to that songwriting.
Certainly.
That is maybe obscured by the fact that the music is itself kind of, I don't know, folky or, very accessible. It's
right.
Not complicated. But when I hear it, I think, like, there's somebody who has really listened to a lot of music, like that. You were on my mind this morning. I listened to that melody, like do 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 do. I think, ooh, this guy obviously has listened to Irish fiddle music, because that's what I hear when I hear that, and that's a great thing to bring into this kind of music. So, maybe again through technology, because we've got our phones here, we can pull up any kind of music. When I was first into this stuff, you'd hear about some great Stanley Brothers record or something like that. So you'd either have to find someone that had it and you could tape it, or we would do like road trips down to Greenwich Village and look in these old dusty record stores to try to find these weird, obscure records that...
The Spotify of your time.
Yeah, exactly. That was the Spotify. But now, and again, so many people can accept and can access so much music, so many different sounds, so many different things. Again, I think it's a wonderful time that you're hearing music that has such a variety of influences, which is, again, I think of it as going back to the beginning, because, Bill Monroe didn't like spring from the head of Zeus, like in a myth or something like that. He was drawing from Arnold Schultz. He was drawing from the Carter family, Woody Guthrie, people like that, country balladeers, Jimmy Rogers. And so, again, like, you go to a bluegrass festival now and you hear people doing music that sounds like it could have been done by, Woody Guthrie or people like that. And also the blues, and also other, or Irish fiddle tunes or whatever like that.
That's another really interesting point, thinking about the history of it, because it does sometimes feel as though bluegrass just popped up out of nothing.
Yeah.
And, even Scruggs, like, that didn't just come out of nowhere. There were a handful of people around him that had exposed him, as well as Reno and some of the other, to a three-finger style, and I think of it the same way as a banjo player who really tries to focus on innovation. It's like, well, that's what Scruggs did. That's what Bela did. That's what Hartford did. That's what Seeger did. Like, all of those banjo players, that's what Vestal did. I mean, all of them basically took this instrument and thought, wow, what else can it do?
Yeah.
And to pivot into your music, because I think it's your point about technology, and the kind of what else can I do attitude. I listened to the first 4 songs that you've released recently. The first 3 are bluegrassy, folky. They've got the instrumentation, the tremolo mandolin. It's beautiful, but very accessible in that sense. But it definitely frames the songwriting. I can tell that the songwriting is the focus of what you're doing. Yeah. And then the 4th song is a clawhammer banjo being played to synthetic digital tracks, right? Yeah. Which I will just say, during the pandemic, Chris Pandolfi came out with an album called Trance. He's the String Dusters banjo player, and it's a very similar type of thing. And I also did the same type of thing during the pandemic, where I was like, the banjo with some digital background. I don't know how all of this kind of happened in isolation, but what got you to that point? These 4 songs, incredibly eclectic catalog, and then these 4 songs are what you've released most recently. Yeah. What is that in terms of your expression?
Well, songwriting has obviously been an important thing for me. I first really started playing music like really learning the guitar. I had a guitar from the time I was about 7 or so because I had seen the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, and that was it. I just knew I had to do this. But when I first started playing music, like seriously learning it, it was because a friend of my dad's that worked at Penn State with him, who was kind of hippie character in the 70s. He gave me the first Bob Dylan songbook. It was like the first 5 years of Bob Dylan. And then also he loaned me, because he did ask for that back, the Times They Are Changin' album.
Yeah.
And so that was a big thing for me. It was like, oh, okay, so you write these songs, like you write down all this stuff, and you make stories, and you do this, and I bet you only need 3 chords. That's like all you really need to do this. So over the years, Dylan and Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and Paul Simon and Cat Stevens and people like that really influenced me with this idea of, well, this is what you do. You write songs. I don't know that I ever really thought about it like, oh, I really want to tell a story. It was kind of like, well, this is just what you do.
Interesting.
This is what people,
they were so central to your development. I feel that too. Yeah. In fact, that list, I would add James Taylor to it.
Yeah.
Other than that,
certainly. Yeah. This is what people do with the guitar. They write songs. Definitely started doing that. And one of the people that's probably most influential for me as a musician was Pete Seeger. Both his work with the Weavers and his songwriting, I think, is a master class in how to write a simple song that is easy to be sung and can contain multitudes of meaning, but is not tied to any specific event. Like If I Had a Hammer or Where Have All the Flowers Gone are beautiful songs that are appropriate forever because they're not singing about, one specific thing or one specific time. It's like I'm writing a generalized expression of humanity. Woody Guthrie was the same in a lot of his. I mean, he certainly wrote a lot of very topical stuff, but This Land Is Your Land is an easy song to sing. It ropes you in with this wonderful chorus and has this beautiful imagery. And then it starts slipping in stuff like, I saw a sign there, and on the sign it said no trespassing, and that side was made for you and me. And you're like, oh, I'm singing that. How did I get to be singing that?
Right. Maybe I kind of double take. Like, yes. What did that mean?
What did that mean? But Pete Seeger's banjo playing was what really got me interested in playing the banjo, because he was doing on these old Folkways records, accompanying himself on banjo and singing. And I'd never really heard that, like just a banjo and a voice. And the starkness of that really struck me as beautiful. And then he did this wonderful recording called the Goofing Off Suite, where he plays Beethoven and Bach and Irving Berlin and all kinds of stuff. And it was like, well, yeah, you could just do everything on a banjo. Like, why not?
Right.
There are no boundaries to it. So over the years, I've gotten most interested in sort of old time playing, like two finger or some clawhammer stuff. And it's just always occurred to me that, like, well, clawhammer banjo is a funky sound. It's like, funk, a lot of what makes funk is like you leave out a beat.
So you
do this with it. Yeah. And it's like, well, that's what it does. And with the song you were talking about on this new recording, I was just playing this riff that I had made up. And I thought, well, I could probably find like a drum loop, like a hip hop kind of thing.
And there's the technology, right?
Yeah, and fit it right in here.
Right there.
Yeah, I could just do it, and it would make sense like that, because it would just further make that connection of like, yeah, that's what it's.
Well, the tones in that song, and in a number of your songs, the digital tones have a softness to them. I've noticed.
Yeah.
Obviously you can go the digital route of music. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with like the Aphex Twins or something like that. It's definitely a more abrasive digital technology. But when I listen to that tune and a number of your others, but especially that one, pairing it with the clawhammer is really appropriate, because sometimes the clawhammer, especially when it's, in my opinion, either not steel string, if it's a gut string or if it's a plastic or a nylon, it doesn't even sound like a stringed instrument to me. I don't know how to describe it, but there's so much rhythm happening, and there's the roundness of the notes and the softness of the skin on the pluck itself. It doesn't really. It just doesn't have the same texture as all the other instruments when when you're using picks. And so, I'm just curious: does the tonality something that you're trying to really blend when you bring an acoustic music instrument with the digital? Is that something that's really in the forefront?
Yeah, I think so. And it might just be that that's what I'm most familiar with.
Sure.
Is what I tend to think of it. I would tend to think like in terms of, oh, a piano would sound nice here, but I tend to think in terms of like a grand piano or a Fender Rhodes or some specific kind of sound. And fortunately, we have synthesizers that can mimic most all of those kinds of sounds. Sometimes I will go with something that's a little bit off, just that I've found, and it's that's interesting.
That.
Yeah, that's interesting. I might go with that.
I have noticed that in your work.
And when I was playing music in the rock world with a group called Neo Pseudo, I had mammoth rack of effects and things like that were all programmed, and that would sound like a jet airplane taking off or whatever, because
Sure.
that's what that song required, was that. But my favorite recordings of that era are just me playing a Telecaster, through a Fender amp, and
Interesting.
it just sounds like that perfect twang is what I was interested in.
I gotcha. That's great. Well, I guess we're going to play some music together.
Great.
So I think what we're going to do is wrap up the interview. Thank you so much for talking.
Well,
this
thank
is
you.
an absolute pleasure for all of us here at High Lonesome. And, for all of our fans out there, look up Kevin Slick, both his music on Spotify and his website, but then also take a look at some of the work he does with the Colorado community here, because that is a really important part of what you do, which I really appreciate, and I know a lot of people here, for as long as you've been working the community, really appreciate. And we're going to see where all that goes. Hopefully team up a little bit. But
Excellent.
All right. Thanks everybody, and thanks to Kevin.
Thanks. It was in 1972 that Bill Monroe was playing out here in Boulder, Colorado, when he met with some local bluegrass pickers and convinced them to start the Colorado Bluegrass Music Society. So those of you that can do the math would recognize this is our 50th anniversary. Colorado Bluegrass Music Society turns 50 this year. And we're doing our best to keep up to date on all the jams, all the bands, all the music, as well as the history of Colorado bluegrass music. And you can find us at coloradobluegrass.org. All right, 1, 2, 3. Child, you would call out my name when day was almost done. Now that you're gone, still listening for your voice, calling me home, and I run to the sound that I hear in my heart and my dreams, knowing that's the sound of love and all that I'll carry with me till my journey is done. I'll be listening for your call. I'll be listening for your call when Hank sings the lonesome, the sunset paints the skies and the leaves begin to fall. Your voice will be there like a ripple in still waters. I'll be listening for your call. That we loved and the stories that you told, they're in my heart every day. Now singing those words with the sound of your voice, like an echo far away up the trails that we walked on Allegheny Mountains, where the soft green pines are standing tall. Listening for your call when Hank sings the lonesome, sunset paints the skies and the leaves begin to fall. Your voice will be there like a ripple in still waters. I'll be listening for your call. Oh, your voice will be there like a ripple in still waters. I'll be listening for your call. So friends, you can find me on all of the social media platforms, I think, and as well as all the streaming platforms for music. And the best place to check out what I'm up to is kevinslick.com. You can see examples of my artwork and buy physical copies of the CDs if you want to do those in the store. Pick up a copy of my recent book of poetry or any kind of stuff like that. kevinslick.com is the place to go.
Hi, I'm Chuck Sitero.
And I'm Stephen Shaw.
Tickling Strings
And sometimes a great podcast.
are teaming up to bring you
Sunday is Fun Day.
Sunday is Fun Day.
Sunday is Fun Day.
Start your evening out with Tickling Strings at 5:30 p.m. Mountain Time.
And then at 6:30, jump right on over to Sometimes a Great Podcast.
So twist one up
Grab your adult beverage of choice,
and join us on the YouTubes.
for Sunday is Fun Day.